everyone, this is Oksana from Easy Exposure, and today we're having a quick tutorial about exposure compensation. What it is, when and how to use it. Exposure compensation is used when you want to change exposure value which was chosen by the camera. You make an image or darker or lighter. Exposure compensation cannot be used in manual or auto mode. It's usually used in aperture priority, shutter speed, and program modes. In aperture priority mode, you are setting the aperture. In this case, exposure compensation will influence shutter speed, which is set by the camera. In shutter speed priority mode, you are setting shutter speed. In this case, exposure compensation will influence aperture, which is set by the camera. And finally, in program mode, exposure compensation usually will influence shutter speed. So when would you use exposure compensation? Sometimes your camera meter can be fooled depending on the conditions in the shot. In general, meter is looking for middle gray, so-called 18% gray. It takes dark and light parts of the image and just trying to average them out. In most cases, your meter will be correct, but not always. This is an extreme example of me wearing white dress against white background. This image was taken in natural light in aperture priority mode. As you can see, it looks dark and my dress and background looks gray. This is because camera was trying to average the image to middle gray. This is how it looked when I dialed +1 stop of exposure compensation. And this image was shot with +2 stops. Very good example of when exposure compensation can come handy is during winter when you have a lot of snow. Usually when taking pictures of snowy scene, camera will try to make them darker and your snow will look gray instead of white. In this case, exposure compensation can help. Here is an opposite example of me in a black dress on a black background, also taken in aperture priority mode without exposure compensation. As you can see, in this case, camera was trying to make the scene brighter and blacks don't look black anymore and my face is totally overexposed. To fix this situation, I had to dial exposure compensation towards the minus. This is -1 stop and this is -2 stops. So if you have darker backgrounds, you have to watch for your highlights that they are not blown out because camera is trying to make the whole scene brighter. Once again, exposure compensation can come handy in this case. And now I will show you how I change exposure compensation in my camera. Your camera might be slightly different depending on the model, so you might need to check your manual. The camera I will be using is Nikon D610. First of all, to be able to adjust exposure compensation, you will need to set your camera into aperture priority, shutter speed priority, or program mode. As an example, I will set it into aperture priority. And I have my exposure compensation button here. It has a square on it and plus and minus signs. When I press it, I can roll this dial to change it towards the plus, which will make image brighter, or towards the minus, which will make image darker. As you see, I can adjust my exposure compensation with 1/3 of the stop increments, and my camera goes all the way to -5 stops and all the way to +5 stops. Even in automatic modes, when making those adjustments, you will still have to keep eye on your settings. For example, in aperture priority mode, when my exposure compensation is set to 0, I have settings of f2 and 1/60th of the second. When for some reason I need to adjust my exposure compensation, let's say +1 stop, you see that my shutter speed changed to 1/30th of the second. And for example, this shutter speed can be too slow for you and you might get blurry subject, get camera shake. So you have to keep an eye on that and maybe adjust your ISO. If we adjust my ISO to 800, my shutter speed went back to 60. Another thing which could possibly happen in shutter speed priority mode, for example, that if you adjust your exposure compensation, your aperture will start to blink. That means that your aperture is already at its widest and you can't open it any wider. That means that you can't really adjust your exposure compensation, because remember, in shutter speed priority you adjust shutter speed and the camera will adjust aperture. Exposure compensation will adjust aperture, but if it's already wide open it can't do anything that direction. So in this case you will have to adjust your shutter speed or ISO. If you want all those things to happen more automatically, you can go to the menu, to the shooting menu, and find ISO sensitivity settings. And here you can actually set your ISO, auto ISO to on. This way camera will choose your ISO. And also you can choose the maximum you're willing to go to. As you know, the higher the ISO, the more grain it creates, though with modern cameras they perform better and better at higher ISOs. And also you can adjust your maximum shutter speed. Let's say you're shooting some subject handheld or some moving subject and you don't want your shutter speed to go lower than 1/200th of the second. So if you set this setting, your shutter speed in auto modes will not go lower than this number, will not go slower than this shutter speed. Even though I said that you cannot use exposure compensation in manual mode, my camera still lets me to adjust it. And what it does, when I adjust it towards the plus, it will shift my meter towards the minus. This way telling me that I need to increase my exposure. And when I move my exposure compensation towards the minus, it will do the opposite. It will shift my meter towards the plus, this way telling me I need to decrease my exposure with the settings. And here is the most important thing from this lesson. Always remember to adjust your exposure compensation back to 0 after each photo shoot. Because it can happen that on your next photo shoot you will forget about it and you will get overexposed or underexposed images and you wouldn't even know why, because you forgot to change your exposure compensation. Also, this button is like right here, very accessible, and I had few times that I adjusted it by accident and didn't even know about it. So before the photo shoot, just make sure you have it set to 0. At the first glance, exposure compensation might look a bit confusing and even not maybe necessary. Why would I do all that if I can just make my adjustments in manual mode? But I still encourage you to give it a try and see how it might work for you. You might like it or not, but just give it a try. It's good to know that this option exists. Even though I love manual mode, sometimes you can have a situation where auto modes can come handy. Especially when your light is changing, your subjects are moving, you have to point your camera different directions fast without thinking about changing your settings. And those are usually travel or street photography, or while photographing sports or wildlife, kids, or even events. But if my light is constant or when I take pictures of landscapes, especially on a tripod, I do prefer to make my adjustments manually. While talking about exposure compensation, another topic which comes to mind is bracketing. So this is going to be my next video. Also, if you are new to my channel, new to photography, I would recommend you to start from lesson 1, which you can find here, which will take you all the way step by step. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and also share with your friends on social media. It will really help me to make more tutorials for you. Bye bye. Thank you for watching. I will also be happy if you follow me on other social media and check out my website.